Mark leaned against the last post, wiping sweat from his brow as he admired the fence he had spent 2 weekends building by hand. It wasn't flashy, just 6 feet of cedar planks, cleanly installed, bordering the back edge of his modest suburban yard. The structure stood solid and quiet, like a line in the sand. To him, it was more than a fence. It was a barrier of peace. After rescuing 2 shelter dogs that had escaped their last home, he needed something to keep them safe and to, finally, get some sleep. The neighborhood had changed since he bought the house 5 years ago. Back then, people waved at each other. Now, most avoided eye contact. Things shifted after the new HOA board took over, especially after Carl became president. Meetings became closed door. New rules slipped in without warning. Still, Mark kept to himself. He paid his dues, kept his lawn clean, and never complained until now. A week after finishing the fence, he found a letter folded into his mailbox. It wasn't mail, just placed there, unmarked except for the HOA's crest in the corner. He opened it slowly, already sensing trouble. Your recent construction violates the community aesthetic policy. Section 5B. Vertical enclosures may not exceed 6 feet in height and must be set back no less than 2 feet from the boundary edge of private lots. Failure to comply will result in an immediate fine of $50 per day, beginning today. Mark reread the sentence, frowning. That had to be a mistake. He'd measured the planks. None of them exceeded 6 feet. He even used a level to make sure the slope at the end didn't create an illusion of extra height. The second part set back from the boundary he didn't understand. His fence lined up precisely with the others on the block. Were they all in violation too? Curious and unsettled, he walked along the street that evening, measuring by eye. Several neighbors had fences that towered well above his. One house even had decorative posts reaching nearly 7 feet with lamps on top. Yet none of them had mentioned any complaints. He stopped at Denise's house 2 doors down. Her backyard fence clearly breached the supposed limit. She was gardening when he approached. "Hey, did you ever get a letter about your fence?" he asked. She looked up, a strange flicker of understanding in her expression. "No, why?" Mark handed her the paper. She skimmed it, then looked at him. "Did you say something at the last board meeting?" "About the dues increase. I asked why we weren't given notice," he said. Denise sighed. "That'll do it. Carl doesn't like to be questioned." That night, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter. The words weren't just administrative, they were targeted. He began to wonder if this wasn't about the fence at all. Maybe it was something else entirely. The next morning, he was startled to see 2 men in HOA polos standing at the corner of his yard. They weren't there to talk. They carried clipboards and phones, snapping photos, jotting down notes. One of them pointed to the fence and shook his head. They didn't even acknowledge Mark standing in plain view. He didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, he went back inside and pulled out the file he had from his home purchase, the old survey, the property map, the boundaries. If they were going to make this a battle, he needed to understand exactly where the lines were drawn. What he found there made his heart pause, but he needed more. Something told him this wasn't just about a few planks of wood nailed together. Something was off, and he intended to find out what. Mark waited 3 days before sending his first email to the HOA board. He kept it polite, attaching a picture of his fence alongside a scan of his original survey. He asked for clarification, nothing aggressive, just facts. The message was sent at 9:12 a.m. No response. He sent another 2 days later, forwarding the first with a simple note, following up, "Appreciate your time." Still nothing. On the 5th day he called the HOA office. The line rang 6 times before going to voicemail. He left a message, short and professional, requesting someone call him back. That call was never returned, but the silence wasn't total. That evening, he noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked across the street, partially shielded behind a neighbor's hedge. 2 men sat inside, one holding a clipboard, the other typing into a tablet. Mark stood in his driveway for nearly 10 minutes, pretending to inspect his mailbox. The SUV didn't move. The next morning, a second letter was taped directly to his door. No envelope. No explanation. Continued violation. Fines now accumulating at $75 per day. Next notice will include lien warning. Mark read it twice. They hadn't even acknowledged his request for clarification, let alone offered a chance to appeal. They had skipped any conversation and jumped straight to financial penalties. It didn't feel procedural. It felt personal. He turned to Denise again. She was the only neighbor who had hinted at the HOA's underhanded behavior. When he arrived, she was already on her porch, sipping iced tea, as if waiting for him. "I saw the SUV," she said before he spoke. "They did the same thing too. Julia, when she painted her shutters without asking, stalked her house for a week, then fined her into submission. She sold and moved out." Mark frowned. "That's legal." Denise shrugged. "Legal doesn't matter much if people are afraid to speak." Her words lingered with him long after he returned home. The neighborhood didn't feel hostile, but it also didn't feel safe. Not in the usual sense. There was a quiet pressure here, a kind of slow, creeping control that most people either ignored or surrendered to. Later that night, as Mark reviewed his property file again, he noticed something strange. The measurement between his rear boundary and the sidewalk didn't match what was currently visible on the ground. The fence sat nearly flush with the grass. Yet the original plat showed a small strip barely 2 feet between the legal boundary and where his property technically ended. That sliver wasn't his, and it wasn't public land either. He stared at it for a long time, then opened a browser and began searching his county's GIS property maps. After half an hour of cross-referencing, he confirmed it. That narrow strip behind his fence belonged to the HOA itself. Part of an easement created when the development was first approved. His fence wasn't on his land, but it also wasn't violating his land's regulations. That changed everything. It was late, but he drafted another email. This one was different. It wasn't a question. It was a notice of dispute. He attached the GIS screenshot, his deed map, and a direct line from the county's land record. He clicked send. Still no reply. But the following morning, the black SUV was gone. In its place, a white HOA truck had parked just 3 feet from his driveway. The driver never left the cab. They were watching, and Mark was done waiting. Mark didn't answer the door when the knock came. It was 6:42 in the morning, too early for neighbors, too deliberate for coincidence. He watched through the peephole. A man in a reflective vest with a clipboard and badge stood on the front step. Behind him, the white HOA truck idled at the curb. No one rang the bell. No one left a letter this time. They just waited. Eventually, they left. Mark returned to his kitchen, poured stale coffee into his mug, and stared at the stack of documents he'd gathered. Something about all this was starting to feel familiar, just from his own life, but from the quiet murmurs he'd heard at block parties. In half-finished conversations at mailboxes, in glances exchanged when someone mentioned the board. He pulled out a legal pad and wrote 3 names across the top: Julia, Brennan, and Helen. All of them had moved out in the last 2 years, and all had done so after oddly timed violations, and fine shutters painted the wrong shade, a mailbox post that leaned too far, a satellite dish considered visual clutter. He started making calls. Julia didn't answer, but Brennan picked up on the 3rd ring. They hadn't spoken in over a year. "Hey, it's Mark, from Woodbend Circle. I need to ask you something weird." Brennan hesitated. "Let me guess. Fence violation." Mark's stomach sank. "Yeah, they did it to me over solar panels. Claimed they were too reflective. Said they disrupted the roofline integrity. That's not even a thing. I know. I fought it for 6 months. Every time I sent evidence, they raised the fine. I gave up. Sold the house." Mark wrote that down. It wasn't just enforcement. It was pressure. Predictable, targeted pressure. That afternoon, he parked near the HOA office, building a repurposed residential property turned administrative space, and waited. After an hour, Carl exited through the side door, not noticing Mark across the street. He carried a small stack of folders and a cup of coffee. No computer, no briefcase, no signs of a full operation inside. Mark approached the door and knocked. No one answered. He knocked again. Harder. Nothing. He checked his watch, then leaned forward to peer through the frosted glass. Movement inside. A silhouette, someone standing, just out of view. They weren't gone. They were choosing not to engage. He stepped back and smiled coldly to himself. They were stonewalling him, but they had no idea what he was working on behind the scenes. That night, he dug deeper into the county records. Every HOA filing, every property easement, every boundary adjustment since the neighborhood's creation. His fence was barely a foot onto the sliver of land technically owned by the HOA and administrative oversight. No one had caught for years. If they were fining him for violating rules on their land, then they had a problem. He opened a blank document and started drafting a timeline. Dates, photos, legal maps. It was time to make the pressure run both ways. Outside, the white truck had returned. Parked on the corner this time. Lights off. Watching again. Mark didn't mind. Let them watch. They were about to see more than they expected. Mark sat in the back of the county clerk's office, eyes dry from hours of reading scanned documents under flickering fluorescent lights. He had combed through development blueprints, utility easements, and right-of-way permits until the numbers started to blur. But then he found a survey filed 15 years earlier, long before the HOA had restructured. The document showed the original plat lines of the neighborhood. And that's where things started to shift. The map included a narrow green strip behind certain properties, labeled Maintenance Access Common Area. That sliver was meant to be retained by the HOA to manage shared landscaping and drainage paths. But it hadn't been maintained. Grass had overgrown it. In many cases, fences had been built right up to its edge or even across it. Mark's fence was one of them, and if that strip wasn't his to begin with, then the violation notice claiming he had broken HOA rules on his property was built on an illusion. He scanned and printed the map, then requested a certified copy of his lot's layout. It cost $25. He didn't hesitate as he walked to his car. His phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. Mr. Hensley, this is Lorna with the HOA Compliance Department. We've reviewed your recent inquiries and would like to resolve the matter amicably. Please remove the non-compliance section of your fence by Friday to avoid further escalation. Thank you. No return number. No mention of the documents he had submitted. They were pretending none of it existed. But Mark had something new. Leverage. That evening, he placed the original HOA violation letter beside the county survey and began writing. Not an email, this time a letter. A formal notice of factual error. He cited the parcel boundaries and included a demand to withdraw all fines and immediately cease enforcement. He sent copies to the HOA, the city zoning office, and more importantly to his neighbor, Denise. The next morning, she knocked on his door. You need to see something, she said. They walked to her back fence, just 2 houses down from Mark's. She pointed to a newly installed flag planted in the grass, right beside her fence line. Surveyors were here. At 7 a.m. HOA hired, she explained. Didn't knock, didn't explain. Just stuck those markers in and left. Mark leaned closer. The flag was placed inside her yard 6 inches past where her fence ended. If the same pattern was being followed, it meant the HOA was beginning to quietly reclaim the strip of land behind the homes, only now they were using it as ammunition. He returned home and opened his laptop, documenting the visit, the location of the flag, and the time it appeared. Then he cross-checked the HOA's bylaw. Nowhere did it mention the association's right to retroactively reassert land control without a hearing. The pressure wasn't just on him anymore. It was creeping outward. That night, a different car showed up across the street, not the HOA truck. This time, a black sedan, parked under a street lamp with the engine off. Mark noticed it lingered for 3 hours. No one ever got out. They were waiting for something, but they wouldn't get it, not from him. He was already preparing the next step, and the documents in his hand were only the beginning. Mark stood at the edge of the disputed fence line just after dawn, a thermos in hand, watching the fog rise from the yard like slow smoke. He had spent the night assembling a package: photos, certified surveys, timestamps of board contact, or rather, the absence of any. There was no response from the HOA, no return call, not even an acknowledgement, just silence and escalating threats. But now it wasn't just paper he had. He had people. By late afternoon, he had walked 3 neighboring properties, sharing copies of the boundary maps and county data. 2 homeowners had no idea they were living with fences slightly over the HOA's undeclared strip. Another had been fined months ago for unauthorized shrubbery in the same area, something that now looked suspiciously strategic. They all had one thing in common. At some point, each had questioned the board in a meeting or vote. This wasn't code enforcement. It was quiet removal of dissent. Mark requested to be added to the upcoming HOA agenda. According to the association charter, any homeowner had the right to present a dispute. The request was made in writing, within the timeline required. He submitted it with a witness, Denise. Her presence changed the atmosphere. Carl, the president, nodded stiffly and promised the matter would be heard. But when the meeting day came, Mark sat in the back row of the community clubhouse, holding his presentation materials, as Carl rushed through the agenda. Budget updates, Community pool repairs, landscaping, bids all routine. He waited for his name to be called. It never was. When Carl moved to adjourn the meeting, Mark stood. Point of order, he said. The room hushed. I filed a dispute. You accepted it. I'm here for my hearing. Carl narrowed his eyes but kept his voice smooth. Mr. Hensley, your issue was deemed ineligible. Your violation falls outside the agenda scope. Mark didn't sit. Instead, he stepped forward and laid 3 printed images on the table county survey maps showing the fence, position, and the HOA's own easement zones. These maps say otherwise, he said quietly. You're enforcing rules on land I don't own. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several homeowners leaned forward. Carl's smile faded. I suggest you take this matter through legal channels, he said, standing as if to leave. Mark didn't follow him. He didn't need to. He'd already sent the same evidence to the zoning department and requested an independent review. And now everyone knew. The board exited quickly, some avoiding eye contact. Only one lingered behind, a younger woman who hadn't spoken during the meeting. She looked at Mark, hesitant, then nodded once before slipping out the side door. That night, Mark received a letter not from the HOA but from the city zoning office. It confirmed receipt of the evidence and notified him that a preliminary inquiry into the HOA's enforcement boundaries was underway. For the first time in weeks, Mark exhaled, not because the battle was over, but because someone outside the HOA was now looking in. And if they looked close enough, they'd see more than a misplaced fence. They'd see a pattern. One that someone had worked very hard to keep hidden. Mark didn't hear from the HOA for 3 full days after the city's inquiry letter arrived. The silence was louder than before. No new violation notices. No vehicles parked across the street. The white truck didn't return, and neither did the black sedan. But Mark knew better than to think they were finished. Quiet didn't mean surrender. It usually meant calculation. Then came the envelope. Unlike the previous notices, this one was mailed, stamped, sealed, addressed. It was almost polite until he opened it. Inside was a formal withdrawal of all current fines, pending clarification of boundary responsibility. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of his evidence. Just a brief paragraph closing the matter as if it had never happened. But it wasn't closed. Not for Mark. He brought the letter to Denise's porch that afternoon. She read it carefully, then held it against the sunlight like it might contain something hidden between the lines. This isn't a win, she said. This is a deflection. Mark agreed. It was too clean, too sudden, and too quiet. Later that evening, a plain manila envelope appeared on Mark's doorstep. No stamp, no markings. Just taped to the door with a single piece of black electrical tape. Inside were 3 pages of photocopied documents, an HOA internal memo discussing ambiguous easement lines, a list of 6 homeowner addresses with handwritten notes beside each, and a blurry scanned image of what looked like an invoice $4,300 paid to a landscaping contractor for maintenance of areas technically outside HOA-owned land. One note in the margin stood out. Keep enforcement vague note need to spark boundary challenges. Mark sat at his table for nearly 20 minutes, staring at that line. He didn't know who had delivered the envelope, but someone inside the HOA was leaking, and now, the scope was larger than he imagined. The next day, he met with Brennan, the former neighbor who'd been fined over solar panels. Mark handed him a copy of the invoice and map. Brennan stared at it in silence. They made me remove those panels. Said it was about reflection. But now I think it's because I mounted them on the edge of that strip. I didn't even know it wasn't mine. He looked up. They're using that land. Mark nodded, and finding people who questioned them. They weren't enforcing rules. They were managing silence. Later that week, Mark attended another HOA meeting, this time with a group of 7 other residents, all carrying copies of the same map. Word had spread. Small conversations had turned into quiet plans. No shouting, no accusations. Just questions asked calmly, one after another. Where is the official plat map filed? Why were fines issued before boundary verification? Why were areas landscaped using association dues? The board had no answers that night. Carl stood stiff, offering short responses and growing visibly agitated. He ended the meeting 20 minutes early. 2 days later, a letter went out to every homeowner. It was bland, carefully worded, but buried in the middle was a single line. We are reviewing all previous enforcement notices to ensure accuracy. regarding community boundaries. To most, it sounded like housekeeping, to those who had been targeted. It was an admission without the courage to say it. Mark didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because sometimes, the storm dies down before it returns. Stronger. He had exposed the fault in their foundation, but fault lines shift, and he could feel something moving underneath. The neighborhood had changed. Slowly, then all at once, it wasn't just the cautious greetings or the conversations that now lasted a few extra minutes. It was the way people stood a little taller when they walked past Mark's house. They weren't avoiding eye contact anymore. They were waiting for what would happen next, when the zoning board's official ruling arrived by mail. Mark read it twice before quietly placing it in the center of the table. The document was brief but definitive. His fence was on HOA-owned property, and because of that, the HOA had no authority to fine him under private homeowner regulations. Their enforcement had overstepped. He didn't call anyone. He didn't write a newsletter or post in the community group chat. But others did. Word spread quickly. And not just about Mark's case. The zoning office, now involved, began receiving multiple complaints within the week. Similar violations, questionable fines, vague boundary enforcement. The board, once untouchable, had become a topic of public interest. Carl, the HOA president, held a special meeting the following Monday. He came in alone, no other board members beside him. His suit was pressed, his smile thin. "I want to begin by acknowledging confusion surrounding certain property lines," he said. "There have been some inconsistencies in our records, and we're working hard to resolve them." He avoided names. He avoided admitting error. But every seat in that room was filled, and everyone knew exactly what he was trying not to say. When Mark stood to ask a question, Carl flinched us slightly. "Are you going to retract the violations issued under incorrect boundary assumptions?" Mark asked. Carl nodded slowly. "Where necessary, yes." Mark held up a copy of the board's original letter to him. "And are you going to refund the residents who paid fines for land they never owned?" There was no answer. The meeting ended early. Again, 2 days later, Carl resigned. The announcement was sent by email, and signed, formal and quiet. The board appointed an interim president, someone no one seemed to know well. But that didn't matter anymore. People were paying attention now. Mark walked his yard that evening with a strange sense of calm. For the first time in months, no cars sat parked across the street. No flags marked mysterious boundaries. And the fence, the one that started everything, stood exactly where it always had. He decided to take a section of it down. Not because he had to. Not because the HOA demanded it. But because the dogs no longer needed that part of the yard blocked off. It felt right to change something on his own terms. That night, he received an email from Brennan. "Thought you'd like to know? The city launched an audit into HOA use of funds after reviewing your documents. Apparently, a few of those landscaping charges didn't go through proper approval. This might get bigger." Mark leaned back in his chair, watching the cursor blink at the end of the message. He had never intended to start anything. All he wanted was peace, privacy, and space for his dogs to run. But the line they'd drawn wasn't just on the map, it had been between silence and resistance, and now that line had shifted. Not just for him, for everyone. The new HOA president never introduced herself. She didn't send a welcome letter, attend the next meeting, or speak during the open forum. But her signature appeared on documents, emails, and policy memos, all more clinical than Carl's had ever been. There was no face to argue with now, just a system, tightened and hidden behind official phrasing and formal tone. For a while, things went quiet. No more trucks parked across the street. No sudden visits. Fines, if they came, were smaller, worded carefully, and addressed vague compliance concerns. The unease remained, like a film over the neighborhood no one wanted to touch. Mark used the quiet time well. He helped his neighbor Denise organize a small workshop at the community center. Just a few homeowners showing others how to check property lines and read easement codes. What began with 6 people turned into 25. More started to speak up. Some even challenged their own citations. One woman successfully appealed a mailbox fine based on the maps Mark had distributed. Then, one morning, a thin white envelope arrived addressed to Mark, but the return address wasn't the it was the city permit office. Confused, he opened it. Inside was a notice of approval for a fence enhancement permit filed under his name. Marked approved and dated 2 weeks prior. Mark had never filed it. According to the permit, a section Of fencing had been submitted for approval along the exact HOA easement that had started everything, but this time, the permit number showed city authorization, with his name as the applicant. Someone had filed the paperwork in his name, and it was approved. It took him 2 calls and a visit to City Hall to trace the digital signature. The permit had been submitted using a homeowner login, the same one Mark used for his account on the city's contractor portal, a login only accessed once. From an IP address registered to the HOA office. He filed a fraud report. The investigation was swift. It turned out, the permit wasn't just a paper move, it was tied to a small construction bid the HOA had submitted the same week. By using Mark's name on the permit, they'd attempted to make him legally responsible for work done on land they still claimed was uncertain. If any issue arose, the paper trail would have pointed at him. It wasn't an error, it was a setup. City officials fined the HOA for misuse of digital records and failure to verify permit authorship. The board was forced to recertify its authority and submit to a third-party audit. When residents found out, the remaining board members began resigning, one by one, quietly and without ceremony. No one replaced them. In the weeks that followed, Mark didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat or walk the neighborhood with a sense of victory. Instead, he rebuilt the final section of his fence, just a little further back from the line this time, not because he had to, but because the land, the rules, and the control never really belonged to any of them. It was the illusion of control that had caused everything, and now, that illusion was gone. As more residents took back their voice, one small question began to circulate: what would have happened if Mark hadn't fought back? It was enough to keep people talking, and in neighborhoods like his, that alone could change everything. If this story reminds you of something that happened in your own neighborhood, you're not alone. And if you're still dealing with it, don't disappear into silence. Ask questions, take notes, and speak up. Someone else might be waiting for the same reason.